And good afternoon. I hope you all had a delightful lunch. We grabbed something here at our house, and I hope my lunch was not as bad as your lunch from the refrigerator. Welcome back to ISBM, the Big Talk with the Thriving Marketer, and we have two presentations for you this afternoon. I'm very excited by this first one. I think hopefully they're going to solve some problems for many of us. So this tag team is going to describe the challenges of online supply management tools, what that they pose for our B2B marketing. Buyers have gotten better and better, and it's just hard to keep up. So I'm getting really interested in this area, and I'm excited to hear more about this. So let me introduce our two speakers. First, we have Jim Narus. Oops, didn't mean to click that, sorry. And Jim is professor of business marketing at Wake Forest University in Charlotte, North Carolina. He teaches a variety of marketing and selling courses there, and he's taught there for 29 years. Prior to his academic career, Jim worked in corporate consulting for DuPont, and Jim is the author of 5 books and over 30 articles on B2B marketing and selling. The editors of Harvard Business Review, HBR, have designated one of his articles, Customer Value Proposition, as one of the top 10 most influential and must-read strategic marketing articles ever published. Dr. Michell Steward is an associate professor of marketing at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm from North Carolina, so I usually don't have to think I have to add that. North Carolina fans. Dr. Steward started her career at Wake Forest in 2004, and her research interests center on issues involving business-to-business relationships. Within the research domain, she examines the interrelationships between salespeople, supply managers, and their internal customers. Dr. Steward has received both the Faculty Scholarship Award and the T.B. Rose Fellowship in Business for Instructional Innovation at Wake Forest University School of Business, and she's been internationally recognized with her co-authors as the winner of the S. Tamer Caviskill Award for the most significant contribution to the advancement of the practice of international marketing management. In addition to teaching in the U.S., Michelle has lived abroad and has worked for the Ministry of Education in the Republic of South Korea. Dr. Steward is also the associate editor of the Journal of Marketing Education. I think you're going to enjoy these two, and I'm going to pass this now to Jim as soon as I close this screen. There we go.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jim.
Welcome. Thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank the ISBM for an opportunity to come in and give a presentation here today. And I want to welcome the ISBM members who are participating and listening in on our talk. So thank you very much. What we're going to be talking about today is a series of research projects that Michelle and I have been working on over the past year that look at the buying process and the various digital tools that purchasing and supply managers are currently using today. And what we give in the way of results is going to be very much so research-driven, in that during the past year and a half, we've talked to some 89 managers, either face-to-face or on the telephone, and we've done a series of surveys in which we've gathered data from 2,551 purchasing and supply managers. So what we're about to talk about is data-driven. Now, most importantly, what I'd like to point out to you is that we're going to give you purchasing from the purchasing manager perspective, the buyer's perspective, as contrasted to the marketer's perspective. And I can tell you one of the interesting things that we've discovered is that when it comes time to a sales presentation or promotional materials, what buyers want to hear is not necessarily what suppliers want to talk about. So there is a discrepancy, and hopefully we can give some insights in how to bridge things. All right, so let's begin by kicking it off with a little quote here. So let me just move right here. And it basically says, today's purchasing and supply managers complete over 50% of the buying process before they ever contact a supplier representative. Now, this quote comes from a white paper from Forrester Research in 2015, and the white paper is entitled The Death of the B2B Salesperson, and it was a very controversial and influential piece in that it got people thinking about, okay, if that's the case, what is the purpose of a salesperson today? What is the purpose of our marketing staff? And it turns out that it's altered. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn things over to Michelle briefly, and she's going to give you a little bit of background in terms of the forces at work in the marketplace. So,
great.
Michelle?
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. It's our pleasure to share a little bit of the afternoon with you and some of the insights from our research. Given the substantial way that we're seeing B2B sales and customers interacting in different ways and at different timing of the decision-making process, as Jim just mentioned, it really begs the question is, what is exactly different about the business-to-business customer journey today? And so that's the question that Jim and I have set out to discover. With purchasing and procurement having even more of an important and strategic role in decision-making, it's really important to understand three key factors that further influence this customer journey. And the first is from the Department of Labor Statistics here in the U.S., and that's the fact that purchasing management positions are expected to grow by only 2% from 2014 to 2020. That's among the lowest growth rates for all managerial positions. So that essentially means there's fewer people doing more, and that leads into our topic about digital tools. The second important factor to think about as we think about the customer journey is to think about the professionals who are retiring and the new entrants into the field that occur. So it's not just that there are younger people, it's that there are people, new purchasing professionals, who grew up with an access and reliance on technology to get information and tend to trust that information that's gained online. This is a huge opportunity for businesses to interface with their customers. The projections are that nearly half of all purchasing professionals today are millennials, or that generational cohort born between 1982 and 2004. The third factor is that of digital technology, whether we're talking about e-procurement software, e-catalogs, or supply management contracts, that this digital technology has automated much of the classical routine and traditional buying process. So the bottom line is that change is abound, and we need to think carefully about how businesses may interact with this new business-to-business customer journey. Relatedly is this fact that not all acquisitions are the same. You can see on the screen this Pareto chart that narrows down spend by those elements with the highest annual spend. The whole purpose of the Pareto chart is to identify the most important among a large set of factors, right? With the old adage from the late 1890s of what we now call the Pareto principle, that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. The key here is that for any company, the vast majority of expenditures are to purchase products or services that are not strategically important to the outcomes of the firm. And the key question for suppliers that's critical is, do you know if the products and services you sell are considered strategic or non-strategic to the customer's mission? Because this may determine what pathway to purchase becomes successful. So next, Jim's going to describe the modern decision-making process that has emerged from our research. Jim?
Okay. I'm going to talk about two parallel research studies that we did during the past year. The first of which, as Michelle mentioned, there's been a lot of talk in the press today about how the customer journey is different, yet we haven't seen a lot of research that actually documents that. And it really begs two questions. First of which is the customer journey different? Or secondly, is it just the digital tools that are influencing what is being done? And that turns out to be significant because it can take you in two different directions. Now, what we have found is that the basic purchasing process has remained more or less the same over the last 50 years. there's a couple of subtle nuances that we want to bring attention to. The biggest changes are in terms of the digital tools that purchasing people are using to augment or to help them make these decisions. So basically, I'm going to go through 8 recurring tasks of today's customer journey, and a couple of things relative to that in terms of how is the customer journey different. The first of which is this notion of recurring, meaning that it's going to be again and again and again. Now, the reason that that turns out to be important is that if you look years ago in terms of sales presentations and how we thought about customers went about it, it was very linear. We would start with some kind of identification of the problem. We'd work through a series of steps, and we'd end up with a transaction, and that was it, and we went back and did something else or went to another customer. But when you talk to pundits today, they talk about the fact that this is recurring, and when you look at the customer journey maps that are out there, the one thing that you'll notice is that they're all circular and they have a lot of feedback loops. The second thing that is a little bit different is the fact that there may or may not be sequential, in that in the olden days you gave 5 steps and here's what happens. Today there are a series of tasks that purchasing and supply managers undertake, but they're not necessarily done in the sequence that you normally would have considered them. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the 8 steps, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to give you some examples. And a couple of things before I get into the examples. I'm going to name some names, but we're not by any means endorsing any one of these tool suppliers. And on the other hand, these are the ones that we keep seeing mentioned again and again, so they're probably the most popular versions of these things. And that points to a number of things. First of all, we don't find that any supply or purchasing manager uses all of these tools. They tend to use a handful of them. So at least at this point, there are very few people that use all of them. And that sort of corresponds to the state of the digital tool suppliers, and that one of the things that you'll find is that it's a very fragmented industry, and the tools that are out there are very specialized. So a given supplier might have a tool that deals with risk assessment, but that's the only thing that they've offered. So at this point, there really hasn't been much aggregation, although at the end I'll talk about a couple of suppliers that are trying to accomplish that. So I'll go through and we'll give you some examples, and then I'll try to point out some of the things that you as marketers and salespeople should be working on. And I think that's important because, I've been in this business for a long period of time, and one of the things that I've noticed is that over the years, marketing has sort of devolved into simply promotion. And by promotion, I mean things like advertising and sales presentations and maybe social media and public relations. And by all means, those are essential and critical to what we're doing as marketers. But if you maintain that strictly promotional mindset, you're missing out on a number of other activities that you all should be performing to have greater influence on who buys what. So with that in mind, let me just sort of go through what we see as the 8 recurring buying tasks that these folks go through. And again, we're focusing on this from the buyer's perspective, not the supplier's or marketer's perspective. So the first step in the process is scouting for emerging trends and technology. The second is searching for suppliers and products. The third is assessing and monitoring supplier financial and legal risk. The fourth is verifying supplier certifications and compliance. The fifth is reviewing sustainability practices in green products. The sixth is comparing alternative suppliers and products. The seventh is transaction management. And the eighth is managing ongoing supplier relationships and performances. So there are a lot of things here that you've expected. There's a number of things, though, that are relatively new. So what I'm going to do at this point is going to go through each one of these steps and talk about some of the tools that are currently being used. All right, so let's start off with scouting for emerging trends and technologies. Now, given the move towards more of these digital tools, it's freed up some time for purchasing and supply managers. And one of the things that I can say characterizes purchasing and supply managers in general is that they're interested in learning. As a matter of fact, the speakers this morning from Dell talked about knowledge and knowledge management, and that's increasingly what purchasing managers are about. Now, one of the things that they have been given responsibilities for is to keep track of emerging trends in terms of technologies, in terms of market conditions, in terms of competition, in terms of suppliers. And in this area, their focus tends to be long run. So rather than looking for something that they need today, they're looking, for example, for technologies that perhaps might be useful to the company in 5 years. Therefore, they have to be up to speed on that so that they can implement it very quickly. Now, what are the tools that they use? And what we found, first of all, that the number one go-to source is what I'll refer to as online resources from trade associations. Now, that turns out to be important because in the past few years there's been a lot of talk about how trade associations are waning and how they're not important, yet it turns out that they're a critical source of market information. ISM, which stands for the Institute for Supply Management, is the main association for purchasing and supply managers, and they put out a series of market reports each month, which the purchasing and supply people absolutely follow. So the first question I have to you as a marketer is, where do your customers get information on marketing conditions, and where are you trying to influence, or how are you trying to influence them? The second source of information is what's referred to as online professional communities. Now, the speakers this morning sort of touched on this, and I think you're probably familiar with groups that you find on LinkedIn. The problem with communities on LinkedIn is they tend to be non-exclusive, and purchasing and supply managers tend to be very wary of participating in them because they're deathly afraid that there's going to be marketing and sales people hiding in the virtual shadows. And the minute that the purchasing person says, for example, I'm a purchasing manager at Procter & Gamble, that all of a sudden they're going to be barraged by all kinds of sales messages. So an online professional community is an exclusive community that is populated by vetted purchasing and supply managers, which means that you have to demonstrate that you're a supply manager to get in, and in general, no marketing people are allowed. Now, there are a whole series of these out there that tend to be very industry specific. The one I've got listed here, Procurious, is based out of Australia, and they do a lot of work. So one of the sources of information on trends and technologies is online communities. The third one that we found in the lower right-hand corner is online market reports. For example, the Wall Street Journal has a recurring section on supply management and logistics. Harvard Business Review, Wharton, and there are a number of other sources, Bloomberg, for example, that have these reports. And the one that we found that was very interesting was the importance they place on email supplier promotions focused on learning. So you would think that they didn't like spam, but they like promotional messages from suppliers if they learn something. So rather than just blasting a lot of promotional messages, make sure that there's some knowledge because they want to learn something from it. So in all of these cases, you need to be working to make sure that, first of all, you know what sources they have, and then also try to influence those sources. And you can do that by sending them, for example, white papers that provide some intelligence on your new products or new technologies or the economic benefits of your products. All right, the second step in the process, searching for suppliers and products. You know, in the old days, the model was that the salesperson was the hunter and the purchasing manager was basically sitting around in the office waiting for someone to make a call. Well, we find that not to be the case. And in fact, most purchasing and supply managers see them as the hunters. That is, they're out there finding suppliers. Now, where do they find suppliers? Well, let me point out some of the key ones. First and foremost, everyone uses search engines. So the key takeaway there is you have to make sure that your SEO, search engine optimization, is up to speed and bringing people to your website. The second on the right side are, once again, the online professional communities. So when I want to find a supplier, I go to my community and I ask my peers, what's a supplier of O-rings, and they'll come back to me with some recommendations. The little logo we have there, Buyers Meeting Point, is one of the big ones in the United States. They do a lot of work for purchasing and supply managers. In the lower left-hand corner, we have online catalogs, or sometimes they're referred to as e-catalogs, and these can be either internally generated catalogs or external generated catalogs. Among the external ones, probably the one that's most known and well used is thomasnet.com, which is, if you're old enough like myself, you remember the old Thomas Register books that you'd see on office shelves. Well, not surprisingly, that's online. If you go to thomasnet.com and subscribe, they have several 100,000 suppliers listed, and all you need to do is to key in the name of a supplier, and they will give you links to suppliers of that particular product. Now, the information that they display is typically provided by the supplier, and there's a link to the supplier's website. So immediately the question for you is, are you actively managing what information is on ThomasNet and some of these other online catalog sites, and are you directing them to your home page or to a page on your website relevant to a given supplier? Now, one of the big surprises that we learned in this category is the increasing importance of real-world or online trade shows, which, we thought that trade shows are becoming passé, but we found quite to the contrary, and more importantly, we found that surprisingly millennials like going to trade shows. Now, it helps if those trade shows are in Las Vegas or Hawaii, but they like getting out of the office and going to these trade shows. Now, surprisingly, particularly with these non-strategic products that Michelle mentioned, quite a few customers have told us that the only time that they actually meet face-to-face with their suppliers today is at a trade show. So don't underestimate the trade shows. And the last category is the one in the middle on the top, social media based sites. During the past couple of weeks, we've touched base with a company based in Toronto that's called Tealbook. And basically what Tealbook does is it provides supplier identification services. Much of their information is generated from what's referred to as social listening. And what that means is that they go on to the various social media sites, keep track of who's saying what about various suppliers. They have other data and information that they collect as well. You go to this site and you key in a particular product, and what they will provide you with is up to 8 qualified suppliers of that particular product that you're interested in. So they'll narrow it down to what they consider the best to the best, and then it's up to you to figure out which ones you want to go to. So again, you need to be working to influence these tools. All right, let's move on to the next. There we go, assessing supplier and financial and legal risk. Now, this was probably the biggest surprise to us, in that of all of the things that are essential to buyers today, it turns out to be risk and reliability of their suppliers. Now, the reason I point that out to you is that, I've read virtually all of the books on how to sell, and I've taken courses at corporations in selling, I've listened to sales presentations, and I've talked to a lot of salespeople over the years. And when they talk about product features, they talk about benefits, they talk about applications, they talk about price and cost. But rarely in any of this documentation do you hear anything about risk. Well, today the key things that buyers want to talk about is what is the financial and legal risk posed by a supplier, and what are the reliability of the suppliers in terms of delivery, product quality, and customer service. Now, the reason that this turns out to be important to them is that there's a little statistic floating around out there that basically says, and I can't verify this, but the statistic is that 83% of U.S. companies have experienced some supply shortage during the past year. So these folks are paranoid that you're not going to be deliver your goods on time because A, you don't have the financial resources, or B, your reliability is terrible. So where do they go to find out about supplier risk? Well, the first place that they start is your website. Now, one of the biggest complaints we've gotten from these folks is that when they go to the financial information that's on your website, that unfortunately most of it is directed at potential investors and not at customers, so that they have a hard time culling information to assess your risk and reliability from your website. So right off the top, you want a marketing task, make sure that your website provides risk and reliability information that the customer wants. Now, given that they can't find it on their website, they go to a variety of tools that are out there in two basic categories, risk assessment and risk monitoring services. A risk assessment tool, basically you go to them and you ask them what are the risk scores for a particular company, and they'll go out and find them for you. And then secondly, there are monitoring services who will basically keep track of how well your company is performing these days. What's your financial status? You have any lawsuits against you? Now, in this category, most rely on Dun & Bradstreet's, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. When you get into the monitoring categories, there's a couple of outfits that we've touched base with, Risk Methods and Rapid Ratings, which basically provide risk management systems. So right off the top, you want to make a big dent in terms of your success. Make sure that customers have access to financial and legal risk information on you, as well as reliability data. And I would start by asking you, do you know what your financial and legal risk scores are? Do you know what your reliability rating scores are? They turn out to be critical to purchasing managers. All right, step number 4, verifying supplier certifications and compliance. And again, these are relatively new tools. Obviously, certification, in this case, ISO 9000, they want to be certain that you have quality products, quality production processes, so you can be certain that they're going to search to determine whether or not you've passed the various certifications for your industry. The other thing that's critically important today is the idea of compliance management, and that might involve OSHA standards. It might involve the components and what it is that you're producing, whether or not it's environmentally sound or technically feasible. It might include things like whether or not you all use minority-owned or women-owned businesses. But there are a number of outfits out there that do this type of, particularly the compliance rating, and we have a couple of examples here for you. And these tend to be the top ones in the area. So by all means, make sure that you know what your compliance ratings are and whether or not you've passed all the recent certifications, because your customers are going to be checking you out on these dimensions. All right, again, relatively new to the buying process is step number 5, reviewing sustainability practices and green products. And that turns out to be increasingly important for several reasons. Companies are becoming more environmentally eco-sensitive, and they want to make sure that the products that they're buying meet minimally established characteristics. And it turns out that there's quite a few sites, most of which that are industry specific, that will give you sustainability green product ratings. The ones that are most popular overall, and you probably are familiar with them, the first of which is the Bloomberg ESG disclosure scores. Now, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance scores. And basically what they do is they rate companies by their efforts to meet environmental standards. And these are largely used for investment purposes, and that a lot of companies and individuals want to invest in environmentally sound corporations, and these ratings do this. The second one I have here is Sustainalytics, which does the same kind of thing on a company-by-company basis. So once again, do you know what your sustainability scores are, and are you doing anything to make sure that you have outstanding ratings? All right, now, once they've narrowed down the products and the suppliers, the next thing, obviously, that they're going to do is to compare the alternatives. And there are a couple of tools out there that turn out to be critically important. Let's start off with the top two, vendor scorecards and review sites. So one of the things that is increasingly possible today is to find out what current users have experienced in dealing with you. I think you're all familiar with Yelp on the consumer side, where you want to pick out a new restaurant, and you go to the site, and typically there's some sort of stars that rate the site, and then there are comments. Well, the same thing has become very commonplace, and it's a go-to source for information when it's time to compare suppliers. Now, two sorts. The first of which are internal, and these go by a number of names: vendor scorecards, supplier scorecards, supplier performance assessment metrics, and supplier dashboards. Take your pick. But right now, this is extremely important, and companies are moving to this in a big way. And basically, the way this works is that every time a company department or employee touches a supplier, whether it's buying or using a product or meeting the delivery person, they have to fill out one of these ratings. And these ratings are tabulated and scored, and they include not only a number as well as comments, and then they're circulated on an intranet within the company, so that, for example, a purchasing manager, when it's time to consider a supplier, can go and look at that company's reviews. And if necessary, they name names so I can find out who is it that dealt with them and either send that person an email or give him or her a call and talk to them about it. Now, some customers share these ratings with their suppliers, others don't. Do you know what your vendor scorecard ratings are? And the reason that this is important is that that can torpedo your chances if you have bad ratings. Now, increasingly, external review sites are available. So this one that we have listed to the right with Loctite comes from an outfit out of Palo Alto called Vendop, and they have several thousand suppliers, and it's the same type of rating system that you're familiar with from something like Yelp, which is, a star system, and then they have comments from various managers. The difference between a supplier review site and a consumer review site is that these sites are typically vetted. And by vetted, I mean that you have to prove that you're a legitimate purchasing manager to submit a review. And secondly, you have to prove that you've actually purchased the product from that particular supplier. And in some cases, that actually involves providing invoices so that they can document that you've done so. Now, recently, we've been talking to an outfit based in Cincinnati that's called 100 Reviews, and they've put together a supplier review platform which basically takes all the hard work out of this, and they're currently selling this to trade associations as well as interested parties so that they can, in fact, rate all of the suppliers within the industry. So that once again, where do we start? We go to vendor scorecards internally and see how suppliers stack up. We go externally and see how our professional peers. Now, supplier websites are obviously a go-to site, which goes back to that SEO that we talked about earlier here. The key thing here in terms of website design is that you want to become a curator, which means that you want to become the go-to source for knowledge about your product category in your industry. The three things that we think you need to have based on what people have told us is, number one, you need product demo videos so that the customer can see what it is your product is and does. Rather than testimonials, these folks seem to want case studies. Now, why a case study? Well, testimonial is usually seen as your favorite customer talking a lot of great things about you. A case study is something where the customer actually can learn something. So here's somebody else that had a problem, and here's how our product solved it. So they come away learning things. So do you have case studies on your website? And the last thing is that you want to have a series of white papers, both with technical and economic information, somewhere on your site. Now, to be honest with you, most customers are not going to read them, but they want to know that they're there. Now, the last two sites that we have available here, listed here, deal with the economics. Increasingly, there are a number of price comparison sites out there. So priceithere.com is one that's very popular these days. There's a lot that are run by associations and consulting companies. And basically what you do is you go there and you find out who's paying what for what particular product. Increasingly, we're seeing more price transparency. So increasingly, these folks already know what your prices are. And then the last one that we have here is an interesting little tool that we found that's actually on that you can buy to put on your smartphone, and that's the TCO Toolkit, which basically does an agnostic, meaning they don't favor any products, evaluation of the total cost of using, let's say, your product versus your competitor's product. So these are all out there and available. Transaction management, I think that's pretty straightforward. You start down on the lower right, Amazon Business, electronic buying, ordering, and payment. There are sites that do electronic RFPs, RFQs, purchase orders, and then you also have several outfits, SAP Ariba, which does strategic purchasing. Now, the last one is managing ongoing supplier relationships and performances, which turns out to be critical today, in that you can be certain that a lot of these companies are keeping tabs on you, how you perform, and how you perform relative to the competition. And there's a whole bank of these suites that are available out there. All right, now let me just finish off here with what's the future. Well, to this point, there's been no aggregation of these things, but we can tell you that companies like SAP Ariba and IBM are working to put together a fully integrated system. So, for example, SAP Ariba has products in each one of these categories. Their goal is to eventually totally automate the buying process so that the customer does not have to actually go to a supplier. They can do this all online, and you can see some of the buzzwords that are used for this. Procure to pay deals with individual products. Supply to pay means we'll back all the way up the supply chain to buying the product. Configure to pay and configure to manage solutions. Basically, we'll look at how do you configure the product. They'll go out and find you the suppliers, and they'll arrange delivery and all of that type of thing. So the future is fully integrated systems. Right now, at this point, I've gone through a whole series of these tools. Which ones are most important? And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle, who's going to talk about some research where we looked at which of these analyses seem to have the biggest impact. Michelle?
Great. Thanks, Jim. You know, I was sitting here thinking that Peter Drucker, the management consultant and educator, spent the vast majority of his career begging people to get on the other side of the desk and on the same side of the desk as the customer, pleading with people, that you got to solve the customer's problems, not the business's problems. And while you were sharing that, Jim, we had a question from one of the guests about the information that customers may look for, and the question that was asked was how much of the information might a customer look for companies that aren't publicly held, and or for those companies that are so far down the supply chain that it might not matter as much. And I think that our research has shown that that's the seller's problem, not the customer's problem. For a publicly traded company, the certifications and the financial status may just be more easily and readily available. But for privately held companies, they have to make sure that they're providing the same level of information to their customers. It may come in different forms, but it's been critically important. Jim and I found no difference in the expectations of customers, whether the supplier is publicly or privately traded. And I think that's a really important question that kind of leads to the next question that we had. So Jim shared a lot of different types of analyses and tools that could be used. And the next aspect of our body of research that we want to share with you focuses on whether there are different types of analyses that are conducted at different points, specifically at 2 points in the process that we looked at. And that is when a buyer is deciding to qualify or disqualify from consideration a pool of suppliers. And then a second point in the process when the buyer is actually selecting which of these suppliers will actually win their business. And so we speak of these as order qualifiers and order winners. And so we conducted a study with business-to-business customers, and we asked about 17 different types of analyses. And these analyses emerged from our depth interviews with B2B customers about their different types of analyses. And we found quickly that customers were doing not only an analysis of the supplier, but also the analysis of the product. So there were 17 different types of analyses. Some were about the supplier, some were about the customer. We have the full list up on our research website that Jim will share with you towards the end. So there are 2 key points in the time we have that I would share with you and like to draw your attention to. And first, that's what qualifies a supplier for consideration is not necessarily the same thing that causes them to win the business. And this goes back to an earlier point that Jim made about how important it is to explain the financial and legal risk profile of the business to the customer and being able to show that that's a low risk in a wide variety of ways. The second point of consideration is that when buyers are thinking about risk, they're very sensitive to it. We have some brand new data we were looking at earlier this week that suggests there's very little that can be done to substitute for reducing that financial and legal risk, including different sorts of price concessions. It's just not enough. So this order winner, order qualifier research that shows what gets you in the door isn't the same thing that lets you win, big point there, and that different types of analyses are conducted in the order qualifying stage, specifically looking at the financial and legal risk profile. We're in the order winner beginning to look at things like reliability of the product, what about the competitiveness of the price, and quality and total cost of ownership. We'll give you a sneak preview in some of the time we have left, so we have enough time for a few questions as well. A sneak peek of what we're doing next in this body of research. Part of this is we've expanded beyond the United States to look at some cross-national differences and similarities in the business-to-business customer decision-making process. Jim and I are working with 3 colleagues in 3 different countries, and each of these countries has a different profile. We're working with Luji Chen of the China-Europe International Business School, a worldwide leader in business education, and Damien McLaughlin of the University College of Dublin, which is Europe's leading research-intensive university, and DVR Seshadri at the Indian School of Business, many of you may know, was co-founded by 2 McKinsey senior executives in the late 90s. So we'll give you a couple of points of teasers of our findings and kind of whet your appetite for what we might be doing next. And as always, we're interested in what your thoughts are and what you see in this data. So we're collecting data, interviewing business-to-business customers in these countries. Our preliminary results, and I'll give you 5 quick key findings from the preliminary analysis that we've done. First, that Chinese managers use a wider variety of digital tools far more frequently, and our interviews suggest that these findings could be the case both because of younger business-to-business customers in China, which are just open to a larger set of digital tools, as well as a very, very intense competitive pressure across a much larger collection of suppliers in China. Second teaser from our preliminary results, it relates to Ireland, that Ireland ranks second among these 4 countries in terms of the variety and frequency of these digital tool usages in the business-to-business decision-making process. This could be because Ireland is home to so many high-tech international companies. Third in this is that the U.S. managers use a much more narrow, much more selective group of tools far less frequently. This could reflect that there's a much more mature and established procurement process in the United States as compared to India and Ireland and China. We also found that vendor scorecards and the online trade association sites Jim talked about and the groups and the reviews are really hot and very much what we'll call on the rise in all 4 countries. And I think the challenge for business-to-business marketers is to learn to ethically and legally influence and be a part of shaping their presence in these sites, whether it's the vendor scorecards or the online review sites that are there. And finally, before I turn it back to Jim, the 5th point deals with millennials and that they're much more likely to use all of these digital tools. You know, they have far greater familiarity in their personal life, and there's an interest, a thirst, an expectation to use and have the same types of digital tools and electronic intelligence, if you will, professionally. So Jim will offer a few final thoughts before we turn it to any other questions that you might have. Jim?
Okay, I wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to listen in, and obviously I think you can see that we have a lot of data, and given the shortness of time, we couldn't obviously cover much of it. On the other hand, if you do want to find more about our findings, go to our research website. We like to think that we practice what we preach, and that's at www.engagementb2b.com. And on that site, we have things from white papers to videos to podcasts and radio interviews that we've done in the past so that you can get into a lot more detail. So thank you very much. And as Michelle said, we would welcome an opportunity to talk to any of you about your experiences in dealing with customers that are using digital tools. So thank you very much, and let me turn it back over to Lynn.
Great. Thank you, guys. That was very, very interesting and very interesting culturally about how things are shifting. So we're going to open up the line here now. Please type in your questions. We can accept those. You'll see the Q&A box at the bottom of your control panel. And then if you'll just type a question to us, I'll pass it along. So I have one here that is kind of pressing, I expect, from an email that came in. So what's a person to do? Right? This sounds very depressing in that you've kind of given us ideas that we need to be prepared so that the buyer can evaluate us without talking to us and make sure we're kind of making the minimum grade before even having a conversation. Is there nothing more that we can do? You know, we used to take them on golf outings and send them tchotchkes. Now, what do we do?
Well, Jim and I are probably we're not a glass half full or half empty. The glass is overflowing. I think this is not depressing at all. It's actually a time of great opportunity for suppliers to show what they truly have to offer that increases the customer's value proposition. It's not going to just be about price. And I think it's a much greater opportunity to plug in to where the customer is looking for information and how they're looking for information in solving their real problems.
I would say where you want to start.
You've got to meet where they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, where would you start?
I think where you want to start here is, first of all, you have to be aware of which of these tools your customers are actually using where in the process. I would start with my website. First of all, SEO, search engine optimization, bringing customers to there. I would design my website so that and the buzzword that's used is curator, meaning I'm the go-to source for information. And as I said previously, you need to have product demo videos. You need to have white papers on, the technical and economic aspects of your product, and you also need to have some case studies on customers that have used your product successfully in the past. So I would start there. I think it's critically important that you know what vendor scorecards are being used and how you're being evaluated. Increasingly, suppliers have them, customers have them, so you need to track this down and talk to them about it. And in our experience, they'd be happy to reveal them to you if you ask for them. Parallel is that you need to know what the rating systems are available out there to you as well, so that you know how you're doing and how you stack up. The most basic thing is to find out which of these rating services are used by your customers and make sure that your best customers are filling out reviews that are very positive for them. So again, I can go through each one of these stages and give a series of things that marketers can and should be able to do. I don't see them as hopeless. I think that, again, it's more likely to have been overlooked rather than seriously addressed. So as with Michelle, I tend to be optimistic about these things.
Well, and Jim, we just got another really great question that fits to what you just said, and the question was, shouldn't companies be doing the same things on their own suppliers and learn from how others in their own company do a supplier assessment? And I think what you just said about, making sure things aren't overlooked, you've got wonderful in-house resource as marketers to talk to your own procurement and purchasing people about, and probably have very frank conversations about what they wish salespeople and marketing folks would be doing, what they wish were provided, what outstanding suppliers are doing. I think this is a wonderful point that we're far too siloed about thinking externally, and sometimes there's some wonderful thoughts internally for companies to begin to understand, own best practices that their current suppliers are offering, and use that information in conversations with their customers.
Right, and a couple of points. And when I was talking about risk and reliability, again, if you talk to purchasing and supply managers, most of them will say that their suppliers rarely bring up these topics. Well, there's a place for you to start, is to first of all find out how your risk ratings and reliability ratings are. Now, in marketing, you may not have the opportunity to affect change, but you certainly can pass that information on to the folks in operations. But more importantly, you should find a way to better communicate your risk standing and your reliability standing to potential customers. So example that I mentioned was on your website. Do you have information on your website relative to your financial risk scores that customers can easily access and digest? So again, those are two things that you can do relatively straightforward that, again, if you talk to these purchasing and supply managers, they claim that no one is doing. So that's a way to get a competitive advantage.
So say we have a company that is interested in getting into an entirely new market, therefore they don't know much about those buyers, the buyer behavior. Is this general enough that if you're behaving correctly in any market, the other markets will respond the same way? Can you generalize all this to that?
Well, in terms of risk and reliability, I would say most definitely.
Okay.
Absolutely. In terms of some of these other things, obviously you would have to find out, for example, if your new industry, whether the use of vendor scorecards or supplier ratings is commonplace or not. But and one of the things that we found, for example, with those two is that there tends to be wide discrepancy across industries. So your more traditional industries are not likely to use these tools at all. So, for example, we've spent time talking to people in the industrial chemical industry, and a lot of these tools are not used there. But on the other hand, if you go to any high technology industry, particularly new companies, data-driven companies, information technology-driven companies, they use all of these things. So again, whether or not companies use these are largely going to be a function of what industry they're in, what technologies they're used to and prefer.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'll just put out a request if there's any more questions. And I don't see any more coming in. So this was fascinating, and I'm glad you've left your slide up there that has the contact information to go to the website. I'm sure there's a lot of valuable things there. I'm going to go check out your podcast because you guys are fun to listen to. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We have a great time doing this. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. Hope you found some things that are helpful and being maximally successful.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you very much, ISBM members, for participating and listening in.
Great. All right, and I will thank the audience as well. Thank you for participating. And I will remind you that we'll end this session and begin again at 2:15 with our closing speaker. I will encourage you to tell all your friends to dial in for the 2:15. It's a great summary of all of this conversation we've had about becoming the thriving marketer. And so please join us for Jerry Wind at 2:15.